Randolph Scott was born as George Randolph Scott on January 23, 1898, in Orange County, Virginia. He was a big deal in old American movies. Randolph Scott is best known for his acting in westerns. Randolph Scott became a hero to people because he played characters who were tough and did the right thing. Randolph Scott grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina. His family was very strict, taught him to be a good person with strong values from the South. The early years of his life were about sports, studying hard, and being in the military. He even spent some time in France during World War I, where he worked as someone who helped the artillery team. This experience taught him how to be really strong and calm, which something that people would notice when they saw him act on screen. His time in the military and his experience as an artillery observer in France during World War I had an impact on him. The experience of being an artillery observer in France during World War I gave him a strength and composure that would later define his presence on screen as an actor. After the war, Scott went to Georgia Tech for school. Then the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. This is where Scott started to like drama and the arts. Scott moved to Los Angeles in the 1920s because he wanted to be in the movie business. He knew some people. They introduced him to Howard Hughes. This helped Scott get parts in silent movies. People who cast actors for movies like Scott because he was tall and had a face and stayed calm. Scott was getting more work by the early 1930s. He was acting in all sorts of movies before he started doing westerns. Westerns were what he was really good at and what people liked him in. Scott kept doing westerns. That is what he became known for. Randolph Scott was a deal in the western movies during the 1940s and 1950s. He made a lot of movies, over 100 of them. Most of these movies were westerns, more than 60 to be exact. Randolph Scott worked with a director named Bud Boetticher and a screenwriter named Burt Kennedy. They made some good movies together like 7 Men, From Now the Tall T, Ride Lonesome, and Comanche Station. These movies were liked by a lot of people who watch movies and write about them. Randolph Scott and his team made some western movies that people still like today. These movies are really good at telling stories that are also very deep and emotional. They show Scott doing his work as an artist. The films are masterpieces because they have a lot of depth, which means they make you think about the characters and their feelings. Scott is really good at making these kinds of movies. That is why they are so highly thought of. Scott's performances were about being strong on the inside. He did not act like some Western stars who like to show off. Instead, Scott showed what his characters believed in by using movements and being very serious. The people he played were usually men who had been through times, but they still did what they thought was right. When he was not acting, Scott was also very controlled. Liked to keep to himself. He was smart with his money, so he could stop working and live well after he finished making his movie Ride the High Country in 1962. This movie was like a goodbye. It was similar to how Scott was leaving Hollywood. Scott made Ride the High Country. It was a quiet way for him to say goodbye to acting. Scott was a person, and he liked it that way. Randolph Scott was a person. He got married 2 times. The first time was to Marion DuPont in 1936. This marriage was really fancy. It did not last very long. They got divorced in 1939. Then Randolph Scott got married again to Patricia Stillman in 1944. This time, the marriage lasted. Randolph Scott and Patricia Stillman adopted 2 kids together. They had a life with their family and stayed away from all the flashy things in Hollywood. Randolph Scott stopped acting in the 1960s. He lived a life until he died in 1987 when he was 89 years old. Scott talked openly about the secret problems that some of his fellow actors had to deal with during the golden age of Hollywood. He mentioned 6 actors who had to keep their lives private because of what people thought was acceptable back then and the pressure from the movie studios. Scott said that the actors had a tough time. Number 1, Cary Grant. Scott and Cary Grant were really friends in the 1930s and early 1940s. They even lived together in a house by the beach in Santa Monica for a time. People thought they were 2 guys who were friends and roommates, but they were actually very close. This made a lot of people wonder about their relationship for a long time. Scott and Cary Grant stayed friends forever. Scott knew that Cary Grant had to keep some things about himself private, and that was very sad. Number 2. Montgomery Clift. He was famous for acting in a way that was very real and emotional. People in the movie business knew that Montgomery Clift was gay even though he did not talk about it openly. Montgomery Clift had a lot of problems like feeling sad and struggling with addiction after he got hurt really bad in a car crash. Scott felt very bad for Montgomery Clift, understood how hard it was for him to keep his personal life a secret, which affected Montgomery Clift's amazing talent and personality. Number 3. Merv Griffin. He was a known talk show host and a big name in the entertainment business. Merv Griffin was a private person when it came to his personal life. Scott knew Merv Griffin as a man who always had to balance being famous, taking care of his business, and keeping his personal life secret. This was a thing to do at that time because if the wrong things about Merv Griffin got out, it could ruin everything he had worked for. Number 4. Jim Nabors. People loved Jim Nabors for his role as Gomer Pyle. Jim Nabors was very careful about how people saw him when he was working. He lived a life with his partner for a very long time, and Jim Nabors was only able to get married when he was older. Scott thought Jim Nabors was a kind person, but Jim Nabors was also very worried about people finding out things about him that could cause trouble. Number 5. Cesar Romero. He was usually cast as a single guy, and people remember him as the Joker from the Batman show on television. Cesar Romero never got. He kept his personal life private. People in the movie business knew that Cesar Romero was gay. He never talked about it in public. Scott thought Cesar Romero was a dignified person, and he wished that Cesar Romero could have been more open about his life. Scott really admired Cesar Romero. Number 6. Rock Hudson. He is a sad example. Rock Hudson was the picture of what a man was supposed to be like in 1950s Hollywood, but he was living a completely different life in secret. The people in charge of the movie studio made sure nobody knew about his life, especially his sexuality, until he got sick with AIDS in the 1980s, and the truth came out. Scott was sad about Rock Hudson's death and also sad about all the years Rock Hudson spent hiding who he really was, Rock Hudson. Randolph Scott was not talking about these 6 men to spread rumors. He was actually paying tribute to the courage of these 6 men. Randolph Scott was also quietly speaking out against the culture that made these 6 men keep quiet. Even though Randolph Scott himself kept his life private until the end, what Randolph Scott said showed that he really cared about these 6 men who had to deal with the tough rules of that time. When you think about the 6 men he named, Randolph Scott did something than just give us a list of famous people. He gave us a quiet look at a time when people had to be quiet about who they really were, and that was very hard for him. Each of these men, Cary Grant, Montgomery Clift, Merv Griffin, Jim Nabors, Cesar Romero, and Rock Hudson did well in their careers, but they all had a secret, a truth that they were not allowed to talk about. The lives of these people show that you can be talented and famous, but still feel scared, lonely, and like you have to watch what you say all the time. Scott said things that recognized what they did. Also how hard it was for them to deal with the pressure of being in Hollywood when it was really popular. Randolph Scott was a man who kept to himself until the end. He liked to keep things quiet. Randolph Scott chose to be dignified and not say much than share his personal life with everyone. In this one moment when Randolph Scott was honest, he showed us how much the movie industry has changed. Randolph Scott also reminded us that it took a lot of courage for people in the movie industry to just be themselves then. His legacy now stands not only as a symbol of stoic Western heroism, but also as a quiet witness to a hidden history, one shaped by resilience, sacrifice, and the hope that future generations of artists would never again have to live in the shadows. Randolph Scott died on March 2, 1987, in Beverly Hills, and was laid to rest in Elmwood Cemetery in Charlotte, North Carolina, a return to his roots. His legacy endures not only through his films, but through the quiet integrity with which he lived his life, both on screen and off. Randolph Scott's story teaches us that being really strong does not always mean being loud or showing off. Sometimes it is about being quiet and making choices. It is about standing up for what you believe in when the world around you wants to make a big show. Randolph Scott was a person, but when he did speak, his words were honest. Because of this, Randolph Scott left behind a reputation, one that shows he was a respectful and disciplined person who cared about people who had to keep their true selves hidden. The man's life is like a bridge that connects a tough past to a future that is more open. This reminds us that the good things we have today are because of the people who suffered before us. They made sacrifices so we can have a life. The man's life shows us that we have to remember what happened before and learn from it. His life is a reminder that we're where we are because of the people who came before us and what they did for us. If you found this story meaningful, take a moment to subscribe for more classic Hollywood stories, hidden histories, and untold truths from the golden age of cinema.